Okay, we're just letting people join. Thank you everyone for showing up today and joining us on time. We'll give another minute for people to log on and we'll start exactly on the hour.
And in the meantime, as folks are signing in, you should feel free to jump into the chat. And if you want to introduce yourself with a note, your name, organization you're with, and where you're joining us from today.
Great. Well, welcome to Inside Out, Climate Equity and Narrative in Canada. My name is Amber Bennett, and I'll be hosting today and helping to manage the question and answer panel. I'm joining today from the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, so the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, and the Métis Region 3, and all the people who make their home here in Treaty 7 in Southern Alberta. This webinar is part of the Climate Narratives Initiative, and it is a project aimed at building broad public support for climate action in Canada. And a part of this work, I'm working with Kara Pike, who will be the moderator today, to help offer communication building skills for climate leaders in Canada. And it is supported through the Low Carbon Funders Group of Environment Funders Canada, as well as the Clean Economy Fund. We have approximately 260 people who registered today, and it's an interesting mix of nonprofit organizations, businesses, government, academia, and they're drawn from a number of different groups. So we have the members of Climate Action Network Canada, we have supporters of Future Ancestors, as well as Argyle, and then the Canadian members of Climate Access Canada, as well as different people who have been a part of the Climate Narratives work over the past year. We have muted everyone here, and we encourage you to use the chat function now if you like to either offer resources that might come to mind as we move through the panel, but you can also introduce yourself, so name, organization, where you're joining from, and we'll be using the Q&A function of Zoom to manage questions. So if you have specific questions for panelists, please tag them with their name, or if you have general questions, and I'll be managing those to hand them over to Kara to work into the conversation. We have about an hour together today. We will be recording the session, and we'll be sending that out to people, as well as with some resources from Climate Action Network, as well as Climate Access and some other resources provided by the panelists. There will also be a feedback survey that appears at the end of the webinar. So if you could take 1 minute and fill that out, that will help us direct future programming and also give us a sense of how we did today. If you have any technical issues, I encourage you to text Maria Granados, and we'll put her number. Maria, if you could put that in the chat function now, that would be great. And otherwise, I'm going to hand it over to Kara Pike, who is the founder and executive director of Climate Access, a nonprofit focused on building political and public support for climate solutions through its learning network for nonprofit and government leaders, pilot projects that test new engagement approaches, and communications research and strategy consulting services. Kara will be the moderator today, so over to you.
Great, thank you, and thank you all so much for joining us today. It's really great to see everyone introducing themselves in the chat. Definitely keep that coming so we can connect and see who all is joining us today. So we're very excited to have this conversation inside out, and just to provide a little bit of context, we've been thinking about COVID-19 and it's revealing stark injustices that leave Black, Indigenous, and people of color particularly at risk. On top of that, Black Lives Matter protests resulting in many sectors and organizations questioning if they've done enough to become anti-racist institutions. This questioning is definitely underway in the environmental and climate sectors, where many argue, including today's panelists, that racism is very much present and holding back movements from achieving what is necessary and possible. There have been ongoing efforts by many climate and environmental organizations to diversify staff and supporter bases and shape campaigns to appeal to new audiences. Yet these initiatives are often taken on without doing the inner work, the organizational and personal change that's needed to understand the ongoing role systems of racism, white supremacy, and colonization are playing, and develop skills to build authentic relationships across differences and work to dismantle those systems. So today we're going to discuss the intersection of climate change and racial and social justice. We're going to talk about the barriers that stand in the way of building inclusive climate movements, as well as what is effective when it comes to doing the inner work and connecting it to climate campaigning. I am so excited to have the panelists we do today joining us. We've got a great group. I'm going to start with Larissa Crawford, who's the founder and managing director of Future Ancestors Services. Larissa is a published Indigenous and anti-racism researcher, award-winning ribbon skirt artist, restorative circle keeper, and proudly passes on Métis and Jamaican ancestry to her daughter Zira. She is the founder of Future Ancestor Services, a youth-led professional services social enterprise that advances climate justice and equity through the lenses of anti-racism and ancestral accountability. She is the 2019-2020 Action Canada Fellow, a 2019 Globe Very Impactful Person, and a Corporate Knights 2019 Top 30 Under 30 in Sustainability. Kat Abro, the Executive Director of Climate Action Network Canada. Kat is an internationally recognized award-winning campaigner whose work centers on building powerful coalitions to advance transformational action on climate change. One of the world's 100 most influential people in climate policy, as named by Apolitical in 2019, and recipient of the 2020 Jack Layton Progress Prize. Kat has more than 15 years of experience campaigning on environmental issues. And Jesse Sitnick, who's the VP of Corporate and Public Affairs at Argyle Communications. Jesse is recognized as one of Canada's leading communicators on climate change and the clean economy. She also leads Argyle's award-winning work on Ontario's 60s Scoop claim. Jesse specializes in advocacy, social impact, policy communication for public, private, and nonprofit organizations. So we're excited to jump into the conversation. I want to thank Amber and Maria first for all their efforts. And just to mention, I'm joining you from Vancouver Island on the unceded territory of the Cowichan First Nation. All right, so let's go. So the first question, Larissa, there's an ongoing and growing conversation that climate change and social equity cannot be separated. Your business focuses on organizational and personal change work needed to ensure there is a deep commitment to and practice of anti-racism. Can you tell us more what it means to you to integrate climate and social equity work?
Merci, Kia matin, Larissa Crawford de Genève Gauchen. Bonjour, bon matin, je m'appelle Larissa Crawford. Hello, good morning, my name is Larissa Crawford, and I'm really excited to be joining everyone today. And so, yeah, I love this question, and I think I'll speak a little bit to how I understand climate action. And this is something that many people have heard before, that climate action cannot be equitable and sustainable without climate justice. So that means the physical consequences of environment and climate change cannot be removed from the social and political implications and causes. So to me, climate justice means that climate action done on the globe's Indigenous lands must center Indigenous peoples, knowledge systems, and sovereignty, and the lived experiences of and barriers to a lot of equity-seeking groups. So this is how I understand climate justice. And I think that one of those first steps for for any of us doing our work on Indigenous lands is to first understand what that means. It's to understand the responsibilities that we carry as many of us are guests on those lands. And I find that in doing this work and in understanding my commitment to this work, and in integrating climate and social equity work, a lens through which I enjoy doing this and which I find a lot of power in doing this is through the lens of ancestry. So an understanding that we're all future ancestors and we all really play a part in shaping the future the next generations will inherit. So to me, this means when I look at my daughter, I see our future generations personified. I see our ancestors personified. When I look at the land, same thing. I see our future generations and our ancestors personified. To me, being a future ancestor really means seeking to connect with our ancestors to understand the consequences of their actions and inactions. So understanding history, understanding our personal ancestors and what they did, but also understanding the ancestors of the original caregivers, the ancestors who established the systems that we've inherited and continue in many parts to maintain. And it also means actively allowing that insight to inform one's personal actions and understanding that our actions and inactions will have consequences on our future generations. So I think that leveraging these teachings, especially Indigenous teachings, oftentimes wherever you go in the world, Indigenous communities are going to hold teachings about ancestry and a lot of their traditional knowledge. And allowing this to frame our way of being provides us with a narrative by which we can understand ourselves as being accountable to the actions and inactions, the faults and resiliency of our ancestors, while also finding that collective power in our agency to act with impact as future ancestors. So I've gathered a lot of my teachings from Métis, Anishinaabe, Cree, and Blackfoot elders and teachings. But again, you're seeing these kind of teachings around the world, and I see a lot of power when I'm in Alberta, I'm in Calgary. When I go into sometimes very tense situations where I'm doing an anti-racism training in the energy sector in a very white dominant group and organization, where there's a lot of resistance or hesitation or anxiety around talking about what we're seeing now with a need to respond to racial inequities. And when we start talking about ancestry, when we start doing that authentic work of understanding where we come from and understanding, again, the ancestors of the space in which we occupy, we're better able to start positioning ourselves within that work. And then really quickly, my personal journey in understanding that my Métis ancestors owned Mohawk slaves and that I carry a slave master named Crawford. When I started to really reflect on what that meant and the impacts that state-sanctioned trauma have had on my ancestral lines, have had on my father, my grandfather, through residential schooling, through slave, from practices from the slave trade that have impacted Jamaican communities and continue to this day. When I started understanding that history of what's happened to my ancestors, I'm better able to understand why I experienced some of the things I experience now. But I also understand a more personal commitment to this work. And I think we create space in professional spaces to really talk about that and think about that and let that influence our work. We get to really interesting places. And so I'll stop there, but that would be my initial point when we're doing this climate and social equity work, to not lose sight of the people we're talking about and the people who've created these systems and what we're doing to change that for the ones that come after us. Carrie, I think you're muted still.
Oops. Thank you so much, and I look forward to going deeper into some of the points that you just made there. Kat, I want to turn to you now. You've had a lot of success building a diverse movement of more than 500 groups around the Just Recovery for All principles. Can you tell us a little bit more about that initiative, but beyond that, what it has meant for you to integrate climate equity and social equity in your work?
Thanks, Kara. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you today. I'm really here to learn as much as I am here to speak. I'm joining today from the unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territories in what is called by some Ottawa. And I'll share a little bit about me and our organization before I dive into your question. So I am a white-looking person of mixed ethnicity, and having an identity that sits at the intersection of several backgrounds and being really deeply embedded in Canada's climate movement, I prioritize doing all that I can to ensure, to do my part, that Canada's climate movement looks a whole lot more like the communities that it works with and in. And that is a long road that I think a lot of us are committed to treading. I work at Climate Action Network Canada. I see so many members on the line today and close allies. So really great to see so many familiar organizations and people popping up in the chat. Hi, everyone. We, for those who don't know, are an umbrella organization for groups in Canada working on climate change. We have 120 members operating coast to coast to coast, and our membership is diverse, everything from environmental organizations to labor organizations, First Nations groups, youth groups, health groups, international development and humanitarian and faith-based groups. So a place for really, really rich dialogue. And I encourage you to check out our website, take a look at our members, and shoot us any questions or thoughts that you may have. But I'll also encourage you to take a look at the endorsers for the Just Recovery principles at justrecoveryforall.ca, because there are now over 500 organizations that have endorsed those principles. And even though I say our membership is a rich collection of cross-sectoral organizations in Canada, the endorsers for the Just Recovery principles really touch every single corner of progressive civil society in this country. And it has been a once in a career opportunity to be part of a team of really dedicated people who have just volunteered their time over the last few months from different organizations to help pull this incredible effort together. The reason we at Climate Action Network Canada have prioritized this work over the last few months is because we see the combined crisis of the global COVID-19 pandemic and the collapse in oil prices, which have had some significant ramifications here in Canada, particularly in certain provinces, as having revealed to us, as putting us in really direct confrontation with a series of vulnerabilities that have been baked into social and economic systems in Canadian and Western societies. And those vulnerabilities look like systemic racism and injustices, unequal distribution of wealth and resources, unequal access to essential services, and the externalization of environmental harm, which of course underpins climate chaos and the biodiversity crisis. And so when we think through how we confront those vulnerabilities and actually build resilience into those systems, we understand and that those changes need to happen at a structural level, because the systems of control, of extractivism, of oppression that really thrive on white supremacy and lead to the brutalization often of Black, Indigenous people of color are the same systems that underlie the climate crisis. So from our perspective, working at that systems level is the only way we get the transformational change that we need to address the climate crisis. It's not we don't work on climate justice because we think that that's going to make our fight for climate action stronger. We work from the perspective of climate justice because we know that the fights for equity and inclusion and justice is the same fight as the fight for climate safety. And so we have been challenging ourselves at Climate Action Network to think through and unpack the racism that is inherent to the structure of the environmental movement. I think at this point, with the Black Lives Matter uprising in the United States in particular, we have been exposed to, at a different level, to the structural racism that is rampant throughout many of the systems that we rely upon to function in our day-to-day. And that is as true for the environmental movement as it is for many other places. So I think we have to ask ourselves some uncomfortable questions. We have to get comfortable with being ill at ease sometimes in order to address that structural racism within the Canadian environmental movement, if we're going to actually make some meaningful changes that will lead us to the transformation that we need within our own sector so that we can help support the transformation that we need at the societal scale.
Great, thank you so much, Kat. And I want to turn to Jesse now. Jesse, you've worked for and with many of Canada's large and medium environmental groups and think tanks to develop communication strategies. What does it mean to integrate climate equity and social equity in your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. Before we get there, I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me to speak today, and I am incredibly honored and humbled actually to be here with Kat and Larissa. So I really want to thank my co-panelists for being here. This is a hard conversation, and it's important to have hard conversations. And I'm nervous. I just wanted to start by saying that. I want to back up and say that my work has not always focused on social inequity. And I think that's an important place to start. I spent the first 5 or 6 years of my career working within one of Canada's largest ENGOs and didn't really notice, to be honest with you, the lack of diversity. I woke up feeling like I was going out and doing a really good thing every day. It was towards the end of my time in that organization where, we felt very strongly that, oh my goodness, I felt very strongly, we're only speaking to the same people over and over and over again. What good is that? How are we going to succeed? We've got to get outside the choir. We've got to expand the tent. And then comes the question, which, there have been so many conversations around this over the past 8 to 10 years. How do we expand the tent? Who's not in the tent and who do we talk to? And, I was a part of those conversations and helped lead them and push them. But I would say that there was some really interesting blind spots around that. And the blind spot was, I would say there was so much energy and effort put into the need and desire to be more inclusive of, let's say, conservative, small c or big C, white, Western voices. And I'm not saying that that is a bad thing, but I'm saying that that is where almost all of the energy went in terms of being able to, when we say expand the tent or get outside the choir, that's where we pushed. And, we can go back and we could say, why did we make that decision? I could say, well, probably stems from Stephen Harper labeling the environmental movement as a bunch of radical leftists, and this desire to prove that we were pragmatic and middle of the road and didn't want to be labeled as radical. But I would also say that there are probably some other assumptions right below that level that I'm not sure that we've dug into, to be honest. And in not questioning that assumption and being so certain that this is where all of our time and energy and funding should be pushing us, what did we lose and what did we ignore and who did we leave out? And I think the answer to that question is we missed huge opportunities to become more inclusive of people of color, to be more inclusive of Indigenous communities, and to even begin to understand what it will take to be able to actually build those relationships. And so that's what I'm really hoping we can dig in today, is to understand where did that assumption come from? Where do those choices come from? And how do we start making different choices? And how do we start thinking about inclusivity and diversity, not just as this nice thing to do, or it's the right thing to do, or a good thing to do, something that we can kind of play around the edges of and make incremental progress on, but rather as an imperative. And I think, I wrote a piece that was put on Argyle's blog yesterday, where I think we need to reframe the conversation from, our environmental sector has a diversity problem to our environmental sector has a racism problem. And I think once we start really talking about it and looking at it that way, it will force us to confront the problem differently. And I want to respect what Kat said, that we're not doing this just to make our fight stronger, but because it is the same fight. And I agree with that. But I also feel like it's important for particularly this group to understand that it is necessary if we're going to make this fight stronger. And if we're going to be successful. We have to succeed in both, but we don't get to choose. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I want to dig a little bit deeper into some of the barriers that are operating, and you've mentioned a number there in terms of, just absolute blind spot, lack of knowledge, understanding this is even going on, putting the issue to the side, not making it central, thinking of it as a diversity versus a racism problem. Larissa, I want to go back to you, though, and get your sense of, from your work and your experience, what are some of the barriers that exist in organizations and in individuals when we're trying to talk about racism and start to dismantle those systems in our organizations and ourselves?
Yes, thank you for that question. So just to give you all a bit of background, with Future Ancestor Services, we deliver training, speaking, research, and consultation services. And I'm a restorative circle keeper, so I often hold restorative circles for organizations working through conflict, often race-based conflict. And I've been seeing, and I work with a lot of different clients, from government to private sector to nonprofits to grassroots and youth-led initiatives. And one barrier that I think we often aren't comfortable enough to talk with, and I'll get to why we may not be comfortable enough to talk about, that I see as impeding anti-racist work in the most significant ways possible, is white fragility. And when we're looking at the dominance of whiteness in environmental NGOs and environmental movement in what is currently Canada, it emphasizes that, it emphasizes the implications of white fragility. So a lot of people's senses of safety, of feeling safe in a space, is tied to white fragility. And anti-racist spaces will make them feel uncomfortable and sometimes unsafe. When you think about, and there's a great table that I can share in the chat after I'm done speaking. But if we look at kind of triggers and causes of white fragility, some research that shows, and some kind of qualitative studies, and again, I'm not pulling this out of the air, I'll share it. Looking at triggers, so maybe an effect is racialized people talking directly about their own racial perspectives, makes a white person feel unsafe because it challenges taboos about talking about race openly. Whereas as a Black woman, I've had to talk about race since I was 9 years old, living in a trailer park in backwoods of Alberta, and a white supremacist drove up and started yelling at me, and that was the first time I heard the N-word, and I had to go home and have a conversation about that. So we don't get the choice of not speaking about race, but many white people have been able to navigate their lives without needing to talk about it. And so this taboo about openly talking about race is often a really big barrier, because people get triggered and they feel that, again, their sense of safety is being challenged at that point. Choosing not to protect the racial feelings of white people in regards to race. So this expectation, often white racial expectations, and need an entitlement to racial comfort. So Canada Reads, Julie Black, she had a really great episode, and again, I can share this in the chat, where she told a woman who got offended by Julie talking about racism and race on the session, in that I'm not responsible for your feelings. Especially when it comes to talking about race. And as an anti-racist educator, there seems to be this expectation that I tend to everyone's feelings and needs equally. And the thing about anti-racism spaces is that they should be equitable in recognizing the unique backgrounds and considerations that need to be held when engaging Indigenous, Black, racialized, LGBTQ2S+, disabled people. And sometimes that means that white people's voices, feelings, and perspectives are not going to be prioritized over racialized people. And for some people, that's going to be the first time that that happens so explicitly. And so anti-racist spaces, I think they make people feel uncomfortable. And I think this is why, when we're talking about anti-racism work, I'm seeing this rush of organizations to respond as an organization, but I'm failing to see a lot of work happening on the flip side that actually, I believe, really needs to happen first, in terms of reflecting on one's identities, on one's own fragilities, internalized racisms, power, privileges. We all live at an intersection of privileges and identities. And I've found a lot of power from understanding that. I've found a lot of power in being able to advance anti-racist change because I understand my privileges. And I don't carry guilt about my privilege. I see it as an opportunity. And I think that the more we create spaces in anti-racism education, and as we're doing this anti-racist work, to identify our privileges and power as opportunities to be anti-racist, I think that's where we're going to start overcoming some of those barriers, and where we can start having more authentic conversations about white fragility, especially in the environmental movement, and especially as we're trying to advance anti-racist change. Because again, these are opportunities. And even as a Black and Indigenous woman, I carry a crazy amount of privilege that I've afforded to myself, that I've worked for, but then also that I just experience as an existence of my being. But it's about finding those intersections. And one really quick example of a more recent time that I did this was I was holding a restorative circle, and 6 members were not being paid. Community members, Black and Indigenous community members, were not being paid for their work and contributions for over 8 hours of engagement. I was being paid, but they weren't, and they had no affiliation to the organization. And the organization weren't moving on getting these people paid for that engagement, which had been brought up a few times. And so in recognizing the privilege that I had and the power I had in being paid to do this work, and in being a third party, I was able to offer some of my pay to be split amongst the people that weren't being paid. This made the client really uncomfortable, but they ended up moving and paying every single other Black and Indigenous person in that space. And so that was a way that I could see myself in using my privilege to advance anti-racist change. And I've been on the receiving end of that in many cases, with Globe, with several CEOs and politicians who saw the opportunity to use their power to give me a voice, or space for my voice to be heard. And I think that's where we can start overcoming these anti-racist barriers, where we can start having more authentic dialogue and really overcoming the pieces that people are less comfortable talking about, and bringing the voices into that are best positioned to start those conversations.
Well, I'm so glad that you named it, because I have experienced white fragility in myself and in spaces I'm in as a major barrier, and I do think leaning in to actually deal with that, and as you said, just sit with the discomfort that's part of it. So thank you for that. And I want to just mention to everyone, please feel free to add questions or comments into the Q&A. We are going to be weaving those into the conversation here. So if you have something in particular you want to ask one of the panelists, you can do that. If you just have a general question, Amber, Maria, Kat, Larissa, and Jesse all are watching that Q&A and can respond in writing too if we don't get to answer your question directly. So I just wanted to mention that. Kat, let me turn to you now, and you know, I think you handled this issue on so many different levels, but in thinking about your campaigning on just recovery, but you're also an executive director with staff and running an organization and dealing with power and money and whatnot. So what are some of the barriers that you've seen, both in terms of doing anti-racism work within the organization, but also then making it central to climate action efforts?
Thanks so much. And Larissa, just want to echo what I mentioned in the chat, which is that was really so beautifully said. So thank you for your insights, really learning from you. So I think as Larissa pointed out, it's not just about thinking through this from an organizational perspective. There's really three perspectives that we need to be tackling this from. The first is the personal, absolutely. The second is the organizational, and the third is the campaign, from the campaign's perspective. So I want to make a few points on each of those. When it comes to the personal, within the environmental movement, and this is not specific to Canada, I've seen this, I work internationally quite a lot, and I've seen this everywhere. There's a bit of a progressive shield that we wear that like protects us from asking ourselves those uncomfortable questions or provoking those uncomfortable conversations with our colleagues, because we're doing the right thing when it comes to protecting the environment and trying to advocate for climate justice and climate action. And so we can't be racist. We can't be misogynist. We don't have to talk about that stuff. It's taken care of. We're obviously progressives all here, right? And that shield is a tremendous barrier to doing the personal work that is necessary to underlie the organizational work that will mean real change within the environmental movement, real transformation. And there are many tools that are available for us to do that personal work. And so we at Climate Action Network Canada, for instance, are thinking about how we can provide trainings, resources to members and allies that can help support some of that internal questioning and some of those tricky conversations that happen when we ask ourselves those questions and then need to speak about it with other people. Because often what we do, particularly white or white-looking people, is when we need to talk about the crunchy feelings that are coming up for us when we confront our internalized white supremacy, we talk about it with people of color and just kind of foist the emotional labor of dealing with our anxiety back onto Black, Indigenous people of color. And, so figuring out systems that put those support people in place that are not already overburdened by the emotional labor of living in a white supremacist system, who can, you know, support people having those conversations as they ask themselves those questions. From an organizational perspective, so we've now, in our conversation, we've used the words diversity, we've used the frame of climate justice, we've talked about inclusivity. Those are phrases that are probably very familiar to many of us within the environmental movement. And I recently had an opportunity because of a tweet that I saw, and I'm sorry that I can't credit the person who wrote this tweet because I didn't note it down, it just sparked something in my brain, of the difference between justice and diversity. Diversity is an effort to keep doing the same thing you've been doing, but have it done with people who look differently. And clearly, just doing what we've been doing the whole time isn't going to get the work done. Justice is about making the structural changes that transform at the organizational level so that we can be an actively anti-racist, actively decolonizing organization that can support the work of Black, Indigenous, people of color, wherever that work might be happening. And I think that's maybe something, you know, it's a newer thought that even we at Climate Action Network Canada are just kind of trying to grapple with, because we've been using the phrase diversity for many years as well and trying to figure out our diversity hiring policy. But in order to change, you need to be willing to change. And I think that's a big lesson for us to take to that organizational level, because, and this gets to a question that I saw earlier in the chat about how do we make all of these changes when we're living in this kind of capitalist paradigm that makes transactional relationships almost par for the course between individuals, and where there's so much need for us to confront environmental destruction, and it feels like we can't get to the work of confronting environmental destruction if we don't do the work of justice in the first place. We are not going to be able to support a vision of the alternative to the status quo that is currently killing people in the planet if we ourselves are not modeling that alternative. And that's why I think we need to take it to that structural conversation. There are reasons that the environment, like historical, and Jessie does a really great job of exploring this in her blog. You know, the antecedents of the environmental movement have their basis in a colonial mindset. And so it's no wonder that at a structural level, there is racism kind of built into that movement. And so that's why I'm saying that we have to get to it at that structural level. We have to make those changes. And that means not only making spaces and tools so that we can have the personal conversation, but figuring out how we create the ability for an organization that has traditionally been a white settler-based organization to be a caring and responsible workplace for employees that are Black, Indigenous, people of color. And being willing to change when we are inviting different people into our spaces. And then finally, I'll finish here at the campaign level. I think what Jessie's point is right? So, you know, while the work is the same, we also have to acknowledge that the work will be unsuccessful from the climate perspective if we are not able to put humans and equity at the heart of the work. I think we, as climate activists who are motivated by the climate emergency, can often see all other campaigns as distractions. And so we feel defensive, right? It's not enough. I'm already so busy addressing climate change. It's so urgent. I don't have the time. We can't do this. There's not time for us to figure out how to dismantle white supremacy because we need to mitigate emissions right now. And the reality is that as long as we're thinking about this as a distraction, we are functioning within a perverted understanding of where power lies. because power lies ultimately with people, not with the existing systems that many of our organizations are designed to mimic. And so it's not until we are able to reflect the demands for equity, for safety, for justice of the people within our organizational structure that we will be able to mount the campaigns that get us to the alternative to the neoliberal status quo that is currently killing people on the planet. So that's why I say it's not a distraction. It is in fact the very future of all climate and environment work, in my opinion.
Great, thank you so much, Kat. And we do have some questions coming in. Before we turn to them, though, Jesse, I want to offer you an opportunity to jump in and add your thoughts on some of the barriers that the climate movement faces when it comes to really addressing racism in our structures and in ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I want to reflect on what both Larissa and Kat have said, because I agree so strongly with both of them, and they have been so clear and eloquent. I think, you know, clearly white fragility is a challenge, even just starting to have the conversation, that immediate defense mechanism. I think that Kat's point of well-meaning people who, you know, A, we see ourselves as good, we're good people, therefore A, we can't be racist, right? And B, you know, we can say, well, I'm already doing this good work. That's also good work, but that's somebody else's good work, right? And being able to make that distinction. And I actually think white fragility and this, the shield that Kat described so well, and the ability or need to really draw boxes around these two movements as that's somebody else's work and this is my work, all stem from the same place. I want to take a moment and I don't know if, I'm sorry, I'm going to go on a slight tangent. Anybody watch a show called The Man in the High Castle? Okay. It is an imagination. I'm like, here I am like advocating for more like Netflix in our lives, but it is an imagination of what the future, or what the world would look like if the Nazis had won World War II. Okay, that's all really you need to know about the premise of the story. But at one point, and I'm not, you know, giving away anything. At one point, a Nazi is standing in front of a map, and he is showing, you know, all of the green space that he is going to create by removing swaths of people from the land, and having this conversation about how good this is going to be for the planet. And look at what we're doing for the, like, you know, we're right, because look at how we're acting for the environment. It's a really painful, powerful scene for me to watch. You know, and it struck me, and that's why I want to bring it up now, because you know what, we as humans can achieve environmental ends without actually taking an equity lens, but that's what it looks like. And I think we need to ask ourselves if that is what we want to replicate. Do we want a world in which we gain environmental benefits at the cost of human lives? And I think if once we put it in those contexts, that we see that we actually cannot achieve climate and environmental action goals without deeply considering the human equity, the human need to consider how we are achieving those goals, right? And so I saw, you know, somebody in the Q&A noting, well, should we actually put a pause on climate work to focus on equity work? And I think that's an interesting question, but I would say, let's look at what's at stake if we pause climate work for equity and for actually the impact on racialized communities and Indigenous communities. I don't think we can separate those two things because the impacts are so tremendous. And so where I would go to in this conversation, sorry to bring it back to the question of barriers, I think we have to go back to like key principles. And again, this is not, I know that this is under the auspices of a communications conversation. And a lot of this comes out in our communications, but it starts with the reflection, the deep reflection that Kat and Larissa both described. And part of that reflection can include looking at how we are communicating and starting to question it a little bit more. The language that we're using, the assumptions that we're using. I want to go back to Larissa's story about being in a circle and having participants asked to basically volunteer their time for this effort and not being compensated. And I can say that, you know, this is not uncommon when organizations say, oh, we've decided now that we need to reach out to X community. And we now want to get their input on how we're messaging around this environmental issue. So let's just call up some people and see if we can, you know, get them to give us some input. But no, we're not going to pay them. I mean, that would be against our principles. And so I think we need to step back and say, okay, how do we even begin engagement in a way that favors and is in support of reconciliation and reciprocity, and that comes from a place of deeply understanding our privilege before we begin, before we develop those strategies.
Yeah, and I see that playing out, and per the question that came in, you know, when you end up with bike lanes going into neighborhoods and gentrification happening at the same time, like who is actually at the table to decide what would happen in a particular neighborhood or part of a community? And so I think beyond the way that we talk about the issues, how are we designing the engagement mechanisms to really not perpetuate the injustices, because they very much do, like in terms of how a lot of people, if you are doing a planning process, how you might organize engagement on that, it's often not designed for people who work during the day, have children, have resource limitations, et cetera, language differences. Okay, great. So we have a number of other questions. One is, I think, really important, and it goes back to, I think, what all of you are saying in terms of doing the work inside the organization in yourselves. And one of the questions that came in is, how do you actually open up the space to have the conversation about racism when it's a long, difficult conversation, and often our work constructs are very time constrained? And Kat, you're mentioning this in terms of it not being a priority, but then also just not have like the time. So I'd love to hear from all of you, and maybe starting with Larissa, on your thoughts on, you know, if you're inside an organization, you really want to start having conversations about racism and how to address it. Where do you begin? How do you create the space to begin that?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. And I was kind of reflecting on that after seeing that kind of question in the chat, especially because I'm working with so many clients right now that are doing a really good job, a not great job, and then something I'd use an example of not to do. And so I'm finding that I have a couple examples that I could kind of bring forward in terms of my own personal work. So I'm trained in restorative circle keeping, and I'm a certified mediator. And I find that I bring a lot of those skills into the anti-racist spaces I make. Most of all, listening. A lot of us, including myself, listen to respond and don't listen to listen, and then offer space to just think before we respond. And there's this expectation that we have to respond right away. And so not listening is a big reason why I'm brought in to facilitate race-based restorative circles. So I find that that's one big thing. And there are different techniques that we can do for that. But I can't get into that too much right now. So listening is a one big thing. On communications, I'm actually going to share, oh, I can't share my screen. Can I share my screen? Okay, someone's going to let me.
Amber will try and figure that out.
Yeah. Great. If I can share my screen, I'd love to show a statement actually that one of our clients is working with, and I think is a really cool way of going about doing this on the communication side. On the internal side, one of our clients, a very large law firm, what they did was they gave an assignment to 2 Black female lawyers to interview and send out a survey to other Black lawyers in the firm about their experiences of racism at the firm. And because there are so few, they went through a process of anonymizing the information. But what they ended up doing was, in an anti-racist presentation that we were giving, I delivered the content, and then what they ended up doing was they ended up sharing those responses in a question and answer back and forth. And what you had was a very emotional display of the real life implications of what's happening at the firm. And what you saw was the leaders in those spaces, no more than 20 minutes after that session, moved forward on setting up a training and strategic planning session. And so giving space for those voices to come forward in a safe way, and compensating the people that are leading that engagement, I think is a really cool way that I've seen an organization create that space within internally to do those things. Now I can share my screen, so I'm going to make this. I'm not going to take up too much more time. But this is a statement that we saw come out around Black Lives Matter and an accountability plan. I saw a lot of statements of solidarity. I didn't see too many statements of accountability. And I was really excited to see this one in their commitments. And I know kind of behind the scenes, the amount of work that they did to develop this within their internal capacity, but committing money to the organization, to different organizations, to the cause, not only committing all of these internal things, but recognizing that there can be an allocation of resources. And a lot of organizations may not have capital, but you have other opportunities to bring youth into the spaces to look at hiring policies and looking at those kind of things. And then what I like most about this, it actually isn't the main plan, but it's the updates. And so they provide a way for the public to hold them accountable, and see the public and see the movement as a source of accountability. And I like to think that that's what we do at Future Ancestors Services too, is that our main source of accountability is actually the communities we're seeking to serve. It's not always the clients. And I know that's weird to hear, but we're supporting clients because we're interested in creating better spaces where these clients can now bring in Indigenous, Black, racialized, disabled, LGBTQ2S+ people into their spaces, and they can engage meaningfully and safely. And so having an accountability piece like this with an update, and I know they're releasing another update soon, this is what I like to see on the communication side. And this is what brings trust to me. I trust these kind of efforts where I'm seeing money and I'm seeing accountability and I'm seeing the public and the movement as being considered a source of accountability. And so that's, I want to give space for the other speakers to share, but those are two pieces that I think would be really cool, and that I've seen organizations doing a really good job at doing in creating space for these anti-racist conversations.
Thank you. That was so helpful, and what a great example for everyone to see real time. I'm going to ask Kat and Jesse to add thoughts on what are some of the things we can do to start addressing this issue. But first, just want to remind people that we're actually scheduled to go until quarter past the hour. So that's why we're not wrapping up the discussion yet. And we are going to get to more of the questions that have come in. But Kat or Jesse, anything to add in terms of how do we begin to open up the space for conversation, and how do you hold that conversation within an organization? Kat, do you want to jump in?
Sure. It's not going to be a one-off, right? It's going to be iterative. It's going to move more slowly than you're used to things moving as an environmental or climate activist. You're used to moving things really fast because the urgency is what's driving you. But we will all have to understand that for this kind of work to do the work, it needs to, I'm going to paraphrase a quote that I often hear a personal hero of mine, Ariel Deranger of Indigenous Climate Action, say: you have to move at the speed of trust. And it's not just about having one conversation or issuing one statement. It's about making sure that this is a process that is going to initiate the kinds of personal and organizational reflection that's required. So I'll offer a couple of experiences that I've had, both at the Ecology Action Centre on the East Coast of Canada. Shout out to those of you joining from Mi'kmaq territory. The first was an organizational-wide learning process where over the course of 18 months, the full staff of the Ecology Action Centre at that point in time took a series of several courses that helped us have conversations about decolonization and anti-racism, and also taught us about the Indigenous history, the history of peace and friendship treaties in the region, some of the important rituals to learn of the Mi'kmaq people, whose traditional territories Nova Scotia falls into, and also taught us some of the language. And having the ability to have those iterative learnings and conversations over the course of the 18-month period was an incredible underpinning for this larger transformational change that Ecology Action Centre had really committed to internalizing over the course of that period. And it was supported by money, it was supported by time allocation, it was supported by all of the executive level managers at the Ecology Action Centre. It was a full organizational wide buy-in conversation. And it was really locally placed. It helped us be connected to the home where we were doing our work. And that was really powerful. The other example I'll give, and this is a different kind of accountability than the accountability that Larissa's talking about, but I totally agree on that point that accountability is absolutely necessary. I was running the climate and energy programs at the Ecology Action Centre, and because I had not previously done the work to be centering climate justice in my work, I wound up really making a big faux pas and making a media statement that was really out of line with many of the values and priorities of anti-poverty organizations that were working on a similar issue in my community. And that challenged me to help host, again, an 18-month process where we developed a climate justice statement and accountability plan with our community members in Ecology Action Centre's community that wound up forming a committee of those community members who we were then able to use as a sounding board for future campaigns, and who offered a little bit of that kind of check-in watchdog role. And it was so powerful in that climate justice statement because we developed it over the course of many months, because we developed it in line with the communities that we work with, wound up having a pretty transformational impact on the work that we were doing and how we were doing it. And so, yeah, so I'll just offer those two examples of ways in which organizations might take some of this work on. And it's been a real, it's been very heartening for me to see that many of the organizations we get to work with are doing this, are trying to figure out how to do this work right now. Because Guys, like, we don't often get to talk about the emotional sides of our work, but the reason we all do this work is because we are all incredibly caring, emotional people. We wouldn't do this work if we weren't. We are doing this because we love, because I wrote a piece a few years ago where I said working on climate change is an act of love. It is. At this point in history, you have people that you care about, you have communities that you care about. Showing them love is working on climate change. And I think more than anything, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us how critical coming from a place of radical love and care is. And this is what that work is.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Jesse, I want to hear from you in terms of what can work, in terms of starting on this path, either within an organization, but maybe perhaps speaking more from your experience of doing communications and campaign work. How do we begin to connect the dots between the work that needs to happen internally that we've just talked about and what happens in our campaigns? Yeah.
I'm still like swallowing the big heart feeling.
I know I'm being super Western too in my time management, also yes. Western mindset.
Okay, so I wanted to give kind of a macro example and a micro example of areas of places to start, and also talk about where we actually begin in this journey, and a little bit about what I like to call audience-centered and empathy-driven communications. But one thing I want to point out, and is that we are not, I don't think, measuring this as a sector. So when we talk about accountability, right? I think, other sectors are now getting quite serious about actually reporting on hiring, and they're setting tangible goals, and they're working towards them, and they're reporting on those goals. And I actually think that is something that's outside the realm of communications again, and I don't know who is in a position to do it, but I think there should be an effort to organize that. And I think that's a big gap right now within the sector, that we're not actually having that really tangible conversation about goals, and then reporting, and then accountability. That's the macro. The micro, I want to give an example that is actually based on work that we've done at Argyle that is not, was not actually environment focused, but rather focused on work we were doing around the 60 Scoop. And over the past year, we led an engagement process with 60 Scoop survivors across Canada to get their input and feedback on the mission and mandate of a foundation that was created as a result of a Canada-wide national settlement, to be a foundation that would actually be for and by survivors. And so the team leading this work was a team that included Indigenous, folks with deep experience, long experience in child welfare, as well as direct experience being a 60 Scoop survivor, as well as people like me. So, I'm a white Jewish girl from Baltimore who actually didn't even hear about the 60 Scoop until 4 years ago when this client entered my office, right? So my own personal learning journey just around that issue has gone like this over the past 4 years, as well as folks who have never worked on this issue before, and who come from different Canadian racial backgrounds. And what we did to start was we actually had a team charter. And it was really around principles of how we would work together as a team and what we would respect. And it was not outward facing. We didn't share it. Well, we shared it actually with the groups that we went and engaged with to let them know what our principles were, but how we were working together as a team that was bridging this divide. And I would say that charter, being able to articulate, this is how we're going to work together. And it included a deep awareness of principles of decolonization and how we actually built that into our working relationships with each other. That helped keep ourselves, each other, and ourselves accountable to the work that we were doing and why we were doing it. And so I think that's actually a really powerful tool that I would recommend to any organization who is setting off on this process. The last thing I'd want to talk about is, I think that there are key principles around putting audiences at the center of our communications as opposed to ourselves at the center of our communications, which applies broadly, but I think is more important than ever when we're talking about this. And I think what people will understand, sure, there's actually, I'll send you a link to where you can read about this idea. Or the charter. I don't know if I can share the charter because it's personal, but with the team, but I'll ask if I can share it. The principles around audience-centered, empathy-driven communications is really, you have to push yourself to know, what do I know and what do I don't know about my audience? And so when you start from there, that is your place where you uncover your own gaps and your own blind spots if you do it authentically. And you realize, oh, I actually do not know what is keeping people in this audience up at night. I do not know what is driving their fears, what their hopes are, what their aspirations are. And I've got to say, if we're starting from a place where we don't have those understandings or those insights, we're not going to be able to effectively engage and communicate. So that's another place to start.
Great. And I would just like to add to that, there are so many resources available for us to really start learning about racism, about colonization, about all of these issues, and educate ourselves and take that in addition to understanding the audiences, understanding the background on all of these issues. And just to say that we do have a package of resources that Amber will be circulating. Again, it was mentioned at the outset that all of our panelists contributed to, and I would really encourage folks. And just to mention, I was on the board of Resource Media Communications Group in the States, and they the journey, and we had a 1.5 long study groups, and that was for staff and the board, with readings assigned, group discussions, and then the staff had access to a coach for one-on-one coaching. So I just want to reiterate the point Kat made about this takes time, but there is support out there and a lot of folks with real skills in this area to turn to, like Larissa. And before we go over to Amber, who's going to talk about some of those resources and next steps, I do want to give all of the panelists just a last minute to share any other final thought, any practical tip, tool that you want to leave people with. So Kat, why don't I start with you?
I guess the one thing I'll say that I haven't said yet is I think we're going to, we are already seeing, and we will continue to see, forces of the status quo fight back really ruthlessly in the coming years. And so coming from a place of care, of deep radical love, and of transformational thinking, and holding each other close in that work is going to be more important than ever, because we are already seeing some pretty bloody backlash from the status quo that benefits from white supremacy, from misogyny, and from climate chaos. And we're also seeing some big, beautiful wins when people come together and do hold each other close in the face of that. So I'm here, I'm looking forward to doing this with all of you, and we got this.
Great. And Jesse, any other final thoughts?
I think we need to all see this as a journey, right? And accept that it's a long journey, and that it takes some work, and understand that we will make mistakes along the way, and not be afraid, not be so afraid of making mistakes that we don't try. And I think that that's perhaps where some of us are right now, where the risk of saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, coming out the wrong way, showing up the wrong way is so scary that we just say, I'm just going to keep my head down. I'm just going to stay quiet and then let this pass over me. But that contributes to the problem. Silence isn't really an answer. Yeah.
Thank you. And before Amber provides some information on next steps, Larissa, the last word goes to you.
Oh gosh. I love especially what Kat said about this work being radical love. We are really engaging in love through our work. And I think what has been a learning journey for me in doing this work and exerting this radical love is to show myself that love as well, and to afford myself the love I need to continue to do this hard work. And so I guess my last piece would be to really consciously reflect on, what does self-care look like to you? For me, it's land-based fitness. It's sometimes it's turning on my email notification, letting people know I'm getting back to them later than usual, because I don't need to feel urgent because other people are experiencing this movement differently. So this idea of self-care, once I started understanding my self-care as being and creating space for myself to be the best mother, to be the best community member, to be the best advocate, that means that I have to bring my best self to these spaces. And sometimes that means pulling back from the work and not engaging in that conversation that day. But I think really reflecting on that radical love and how we're affording ourselves that is going to be so important to our sustainability in doing this work.
Thank you. I'm so grateful for all of you, Larissa, Kat, and Jesse, for taking the time today, sharing your expertise, sharing your passion and emotions and the pain of all of this too. So thank you all, and we look forward to continuing the conversation, and Amber's going to fill us in on how we're going to do that.
Great. Thank you. And thank you to everybody who gave their time, including our panelists, but also the attendees. We had a really robust conversation happening in the chat. And so thank you everybody for your time. To continue, we have two pieces. So one, we're going to share some resources after this in the next day with some of the key takeaways, some of the resources that were shared in the chat, as well as some pieces that were provided by Climate Action Network Canada on anti-racism, and also some equity and climate justice resources from Climate Access. And we have some materials that were prepared, a blog, and some other resource materials from Future Ancestors and Jesse through Argyle. The other piece that's going to happen is we are working with Larissa to develop a deeper dive into some of this work for organizations. And as a part of the follow-up feedback survey that will appear on your screen when this ends, but we'll also send it out with the recording and the resources, there'll be an option for you to express interest if you're interested in following up with a workshop to do some of this work later or earlier in the fall. So I encourage you to please provide us with feedback if there are other topics that you're interested in or other ways that we can support you. That will all be captured in the feedback. So otherwise, thank you everybody. I hope that this was an interesting, nourishing, and energizing conversation, and we look forward to seeing you again in this space in the near future. Thanks.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you. And thank you, Raina, my little sister, for showing up.
Oh. Bye, guys.